I'm going to be speaking about the Dayton Triangles football team. So we're going to cover the history of the team, including some of the players and coaches, including also what happened to the team after it made history with the very first NFL game. And then along the way, we'll dig into its roots. So before the Triangles were formed, there were some earlier versions, which actually included a different sport. And then two of Dayton's most prominent industrialists in their companies also played a role in the story. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the famous stadium at Triangle Park and what happened to that over the years after the team was no more. And then we'll finish with a couple of more recent efforts to honor Dayton's NFL history. So today, Dayton is a great sports town for minor league baseball, college basketball, and much, much more. But despite all the many passionate fans we have here in the Gem City, having a team in one of the major professional leagues is just not really a realistic possibility. But over a century ago, it was a very different story. So as we all know, Dayton will always have a special place in the history of the NFL. And then interestingly, also, the two teams we're looking at on this slide for contemporary Dayton sports will both be mentioned in the story tonight. So starting with our beloved Dayton Flyers there on the right, it's interesting that the story of the Triangles also begins at UD, or as it was called then, St. Mary's Institute, and then right around then changed to St. Mary's College. So the story starts not with football, but with basketball. There was a basketball team at St. Mary's for years. Here's a look at the varsity squad as they looked in 1907. But the team that would eventually become the Triangles was a club basketball team, and that was called the St. Mary's Cadets. And they were formed in 1912 and were made up of some St. Mary's alumni, so some of the players we saw in the previous slide, and then a few other local basketball players mixed in. So here's a team photo I got from a newspaper article. And the Cadets basketball team actually enjoyed quite a bit of success. So here's a report from one of their games in 1912, which involved the fans storming the court after a victory. But actually, if you read the article, the fans stormed the court before it was actually over. So you can see if you can see the words, it says it was several minutes before the floor could be cleared and play resumed. So I think the team took the lead and the fans just couldn't hold their excitement and ran on the court, and they had to be cleared out. And then the team's second season was even better, as the basketball cadets even won a 1913 national championship, according to some sources. Now, actually, they played an independent schedule, which included a win over a team called the Buffalo Germans, which was widely considered the best team in the country. So that one win led the cadets to declare themselves national and sometimes even world champions. So you can be the judge of that, I suppose. But for the fall 1913 season, they also formed a football team under the Cadets name, and they would gradually shift their focus to the gridiron. So here's an image of the St. Mary's varsity football team from 1911. And then the player circled here as number 25 is Al Mart, who we will see a lot more later in the story. But by 1910, there was already a pretty good semi-pro football scene here in Dayton. So right around then, teams calling themselves the Wolverines, Miamis, McKinleys, Westwoods, Oxfords, Republics, and Nationals all played at different parks around the city. And this was an era in which most of those semi-pro football players would work a factory job during the day, practice in the evenings, and then they'd play games on the weekends to earn a little bit of extra money. So the Cadets football team would quickly experience some pretty big success, much like the basketball team. So Al Mart, who we just saw, he was the team captain and the quarterback. And this is an article from the Dayton Daily News where he actually wrote this in praise of the team's fullback named Babe Zimmerman. And you can sort of zoom in, you can see there's these funny illustrations. So I have a slide where I looked at the one on the left, which shows that Babe would seem like dynamite as he ran through the line. So, you can see all the opposition flying in different directions. And then on the right, it shows that he made the team when he apparently weighed only 96 pounds. So I think that illustrates some of the differences between football players of the early 1900s and what we would see today. Here is a 1914 game report for the Cadets football team in a victory over a West Carrollton team. And this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. So the game itself, the report reads that it was one of the hardest fought games ever played on a local gridiron. And if you can see on the right, you can learn a little bit about how the game was played back then by looking at the positions. So you can see that there's the end, tackle, and guard on each side of the center. So you got a 7-man line, then you've got the quarterback, and then the fullback, and then 2 halfbacks left and right. So it was almost exclusively a running game, and we'll talk a little more about that later. But the other really interesting thing about this report is if you look at the West Carrollton team, you'll see that their star player was named Lou Partlow, and he will also be an important name that we'll see again soon. So remember that name. So the Cadets football team went an undefeated 7-0 its first year, and then it went on to win the Dayton City Championship 3 years in a row, and also beat a team from Cincinnati 27-0 to win a Southern Ohio championship. And then along the way, they changed their name to the Dayton Gym Cadets from the St. Mary's Cadets. And that was because they became sponsored by the Dayton Gymnasium Club, which was located on Wayne Ave. And in my research, in general, I love to really dig into old maps to try to trace the locations of places that are mentioned in the sources. So here you can see circled is that Dayton Gymnasium Club around that time period. So this is right on Wayne Ave, and this is in the old Haymarket neighborhood, which is part of one of the chapters in my book. And so all the streets above, which is to the east of Wayne in this image, are no longer there. And interestingly, if you look at the 300 block of Howard, you'll actually see one of those homes was where famous author Paul Laurence Dunbar was born as well. So just right next to the club here. And then where that gymnasium club was located is basically right here, which is where the Dayton Theater Guild building is today. So much of that area had been cleared out. You see there is still a little pocket of historic buildings there. And this is about right across the street from Wheat Penny, if you're familiar with that restaurant. So some interesting stories there already, and we can see how the Cadets have already come a long way. But the team that would go on to make NFL history came about through the efforts of some prominent Dayton industrialists. So Edward Deeds and Charles Kettering played a role, and these two are, of course, quite famous names. They began working at National Cash Register, but while tinkering with projects on the side, they turned into Kettering's invention of the automobile self-starter, which the two grew into a manufacturing powerhouse, employing thousands of people around the city. So in 1916, the Cadets team was reorganized in part to provide a recreational outlet for the employees at 3 Dayton companies that were founded by this duo. So if you go and if you pull up the historic marker for the Triangles in the first NFL game, it says that those 3 companies were Delco, which is the most well-known of the 3, and then the Dayton Metal Products Company, as well as the Domestic Engineering Company, which was later called Delco Light. And one of the reasons for the Triangles name is that those companies were said to form an industrial triangle of plants in downtown Dayton. So we'll look a little bit, just briefly, at that industrial connection to the team. So there's a picture of Delco's second factory building, which had been built in 1915, so right around the same time. And then the little building you see just to the left in the back is their first factory. And if we zoom out to see an aerial of the whole Delco site, this is what it looked like a little bit later, but Delco occupied whole city blocks, a combination of their own purpose-built factory buildings, as well as other smaller, previously standing buildings that they either leased or purchased. So just a huge operation. And unlike many of the other industrial companies of Dayton's past, like NCR, which I mentioned before too, which have very little physical trace of their history, Delco is very well preserved. So that 1915 building is still there and was just redeveloped. The first factory has been open for a while as loft apartments, and this is, of course, right by the Dayton Dragons ballpark. So you can see where the other team in our first slide comes back into the story just by way of Delco being located around that location. So if you see the third factory building was this big one there, and that was the one that was demolished. So I feel like at least trading it for a ballpark would be a decent trade. And we kept the two more historically significant ones. So to quickly just go into those other two companies, I was trying to see if there was like a neat little triangle I could show on the map, but it seems that there wasn't really exactly like that shape. From what I could find, here's one source from 1918, said that it does refer that these three companies were known popularly as the Triangle Companies. But when the Domestic Engineering Company was founded, it was basically in the same place as that Dayton Metal Products Company. So it's certainly possible at some point there was something of a triangle with their early buildings, but it seems a little more like that was just that they were closely co-located in the downtown area. There's another of those old Sanborn maps that I always like to use. So that's showing the Dayton Metal Products Company there by Taylor and Webster Streets near Monument Ave. Anyone curious about that location? That would later become the Frigidaire downtown plant. So here is a much later view of that, long after Frigidaire left. And then that exact same view is today part of the Tech Town development that was later done downtown. And then here's a somewhat sad image of that Frigidaire plant being demolished right around, I believe, 2008 range. Okay, so with that, we are going to move back to the team and to the other inspiration for the Triangles name. So that is the field where they actually played. So this one, we do have a neat little triangle. So also in 1916, Deeds and Kettering purchased a large plot of land just north of downtown. And as you can see, it was generally triangular in shape. And that was given the name of Triangle Park. So this land included one estate owned by Daniel Eldridge Mead, who was the founder of the Mead Paper Company. And it also included the land around it. And the original purpose was to save this land from development, because that was during a time when Dayton was growing fast and lots of these types of lots were being snapped up and developed. And they also wanted to create a park for the employees of their companies. So Triangle Park opened on July 4th, 1917, with a picnic for employees and their families at those different companies. And then later that year, it also became a World War I recruitment site for nearly 200 men who enlisted as Camp Triangle, Battery D, 1st Ohio Field Artillery. And then here is an article I found where the Triangle Park Company was incorporated. And the name that you see here, Nelson S. Talbot, brings us back to the actual football team because he was the coach of that new team in 1916. So that was the team that would first be called the Triangles, and the nucleus of the team was the Cadets. But it was filled out, the roster was filled out with additional employees from those three companies that we mentioned. And Talbot himself had been an All-American tailback at Yale, and the Talbot family was also a prominent name locally. So his father was a well-known engineer, and then his brother, Harold E. Talbot, was once the chief of aircraft production at McCook Field, so pretty close to Triangle Park, and then he later became secretary of the whole U.S. Air Force. And he coached the team in 1916, but then he left to serve in World War I, and then he even coached the Camp Sherman football team during that time. And interestingly, the Camp Sherman team actually came to Dayton to play the Triangles in 1917, and you can see here they played at the fairgrounds, and the Camp Sherman team played, you can see down below, the Denison University team played a half, and then the Triangles played a half. So, interesting connection there. Getting back to Triangle Park, here is an aerial view that I don't have an exact date, but you can see the rivers, and then you can see the footprint of the football field, of course, around a baseball diamond there. And so the team had its first season in 1916, and the first game really couldn't have gone any better. So the Triangles beat the Cincinnati Northerns 72-0. And the whole first season would be a major success. The Triangles were 8-0, and they won the Ohio League Championship that year. And despite the name, that actually included teams from Detroit as well as a few others that were outside the state, but the majority were Ohio teams. And I also found that they were apparently the only undefeated professional football team in the country in that year. So another of the founders of the team was Carl Stork. And he also worked as a foreman at NCR. So we've mentioned a couple of NCR connections. And in high school, he had actually been a three-sport athlete at Stivers High School. And then he would be the key figure in the Triangles, really taking the next jump from these more state-based and local competitions to what became the NFL. So in August and September of 1920, Stork would represent the Triangles at a series of meetings that were held at the auto dealership of Ralph Hay, who was the owner of the Canton Bulldogs. And those meetings established the American Professional Football Association, or the APFA, which would change its name to the National Football League in 1922. So in addition to the Triangles, the other founding members of the league were the Akron Pros, the Canton Bulldogs of Hay, Cleveland Indians, Decatur Staleys, Hammond Pros, Massillon Tigers, Muncie Flyers, Racine Cardinals, Rochester Jeffersons, and Rock Island Independents. So you can see a lot of Midwest industrial cities were really the league in those years. And then the very famous inaugural game of the league, which was, of course, held here in Dayton at Triangle Park, that occurred on October 3rd, 1920, and it was against the Columbus Panhandles. So here is a news article from Dayton on October 3rd, so previewing the game. So here's a few pictures of some of the Triangles players. So to get into the game that day, the tickets cost $1.75. Triangle Park was said to hold about 5,000 people at one point, so there were 4,000 fans there for that inaugural game. And then the players earned about $50 for the game, so that's another big difference to what they make today in the NFL. And then Bud Talbot, who we looked at, or Nelson Talbot, Bud was his nickname, had returned as the team's coach by this point. So he coached a couple more years as well. And he was the coach in that famous 1920 season. So the Triangles did emerge victorious in that first game. It was actually scoreless until the third quarter, so it was a very, very close, hard-fought game when the Triangles eventually took the lead, and then they would add a second touchdown to finish with a 14-0 shutout win. So you can go through the box score to see the players on both teams. And then the first touchdown was scored by Lou Partlow. So the guy we saw back actually playing against the Cadets for the West Carrollton team, he became one of the stars of the Triangles. So he was also said to employ an interesting method of practice. So according to one source, he would run through heavily wooded country along the Miami River near his home in West Carrollton. So I don't know exactly where that was, but this is where the bike path goes through by the river in West Carrollton. So it could have been right around those woods. And he would run close to the trees as if picking a hole and occasionally run full tilt into one of them to toughen up his shoulder for blocking. So you can get a sense of the toughness of some of the players back in these early years. And then a couple of weeks after that very famous game comes what some people would actually call the Triangles' greatest game of that year. And it wasn't even a win, but it was a tie versus the Canton Bulldogs. And Canton famously featured the legendary Jim Thorpe, who would be later elected to the NFL's inaugural Hall of Fame class, also played professional baseball, won Olympic gold medals. At the time of this contest, which was on October 25th of 1920, the Canton Bulldogs had not been scored on for 9 games, and they hadn't lost a game since 1915. However, it was Thorpe's final season that he would play with the team, and it seemed like he was maybe more of a coach role, so didn't really play as regularly as he had before. But it was still a huge accomplishment for the Triangles to break that streak that they hadn't been scored on for so long. And then if it wasn't for the Triangles kicker, who was named Hobby Kinderdine, apparently his toe slipped on one of the extra points. And you can see the score ended up 20-20. So if it wasn't for that slip, they would have actually beat Canton as well. So the Triangles did keep winning some of their other games, and I have this one where they went to Rock Island, and I just threw this in to just show some of the game recaps are just really crazy from these years. So if you can read the top there, it says, the Dayton Triangles were speeding on their way back to Dayton today with the scalps of the independents of this city hanging at their belts. tagged 21-0 as a result of the game, which the teams played here yesterday in a driving snowstorm. So very vivid imagery there. And again, a little bit of the brutality of the game, I think, is exemplified there. So overall, that first season was a big success for the team. The Triangles finished with a 5-2-2 record. So we mentioned a couple of the players already. Frank Bacon, who scored the second touchdown in that inaugural game. He would be the league's leading scorer of the season with 32 points. And the Triangles only lost their games to Akron, which won the league after what was basically a de facto championship game versus the Decatur Staleys. And then just 2 years later, the Staleys would adopt a more recognizable name, the Chicago Bears. And so Akron won, but the format of the new league, especially in this first season, was a little bit strange. So the teams were allowed to schedule their own games, and that included some games against non-APFA opponents. And they ended up all playing different numbers of games. So that final Akron-Decatur game was a scoreless tie. And then Akron was actually named the champion not by winning a game or their record, but by a vote. So they got the teams together to vote, and I believe two other teams had more wins than them. They were the only undefeated team, but you can certainly make a case for a couple of the other teams to have earned that first title. And I think this is another good time to talk a little bit on the strategy and also a little bit on the equipment of the game. So you can see that back then they wore leather helmets, but according to one Triangles player I saw quoted, he said, if it got too hot, we wouldn't wear helmets at all. And then when players started wearing more padded helmets later, some of these old players thought they were just being wimps. And so that's another thing that has changed quite a bit with football since those days. But as we saw earlier and talked about a little bit, the game really was primarily a running game back then. So one NFL source that I looked up said that the rules in place at the time didn't encourage the pass at all. So to legally pass the ball, the thrower had to be 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And if this rule was not adhered to, it was not like losing 5 yards, but it was a turnover to the defense. And then the rules even stipulated that if a pass was incomplete and untouched by either team, the ball would also turn over to the defense. So pretty high stakes for a pass. Plus, the ball in those days was, quote, round and bulky, hardly suited for holding, let alone pinpoint accuracy. So you can sort of see how the game would evolve. And it wouldn't be until 1933 when those rules began to be changed and made the pass a little bit more feasible. But from what I've found, the Triangles were maybe something of an exception to those rules, and in some ways a little bit ahead of their time too. So we talked about Al Mart, who was the quarterback of the team, going all the way back to the St. Mary's varsity team, and then the Cadets, and then the Triangles in 1920. So he actually led the league in passing in 1920. Now that amounted to just 28 passes for 591 yards. So wouldn't be leading the league today, but that was a lot for 1920. And there's a lot of sources that are very complimentary of his skills as a passer. And again, with that round, very difficult to control ball. So one game report that the Triangles played against Detroit said that his passes come like a rifle shot. He gets the ball to his man faster and with more accuracy than anybody who has ever raced around on the Detroit football greens. So he was, perhaps a bit of ahead of his time, or kind of innovating in some ways that would, of course, get a lot more popular in the ensuing decades. So after that great 1920 season, the Triangles would come back to post a very respectable 4-4-1 in the 1921 season. But the years after that would prove to be much more of a struggle for the Dayton team. So part of this was that the Triangles really remained a team made up of locals, still working their factory jobs, while other teams in the NFL, we mentioned the Bears, and then Curly Lambeau's Green Bay Packers came on the scene very quickly. And some of those teams would just start adding all the best college players from all around the country. So the team's 4-3-1 finish in 1922 would be the last time the Triangles would post a winning record. And then they would only win 5 more games in their remaining 8 seasons. So it started getting bad pretty fast. So we can go through some of the news reports. So here in 1924, you can see the team losing its fourth straight. And then from 1925 to 1929, the team won only 2 games. So here's one from 1926 where you can see they went to Philadelphia and lost 35-0. So you can see how the roster changed. You can still see some of the same names from previous years, but it got much more of a struggle for Dayton. By that point, the crowds really started to dwindle at Triangle Park, and this led the team to play primarily on the road because the monetary guarantees they could get by traveling that far exceeded what they would be able to earn at home with ticket revenue. So this would keep the team in business, at least for a little while, and as I said before, many of the Triangles players still held their day jobs, which was becoming less common across the league. And in some of these later 1920s seasons, the team would actually travel on the weekends in a rented Pullman car hitched to the back of a train so they could be home for work Monday mornings. So they were still, devoted to their factory work and really just still kind of playing football on the side. I have an ad for a rare Triangles home game. So 1927, they played a game where you can see the main attraction was not the teams, but that Red Grange was coming to play. And I also like this because you can see there's prices at the bottom. So $2.50 for box seats. They had a reserved section for $1.50, and then general admission was $1, and then children could get in for 50 cents. So after those winless seasons in 1928 and 1929, the writing was really on the wall for the Triangles. They just weren't going to really be able to sustain a team in an increasingly competitive league. So by 1930, the situation was untenable, and the team was moved to Brooklyn. And they first became the Brooklyn Dodgers. And the team's folding was said to be not widely mourned here in Dayton. People had kind of lost interest by then. But it's really interesting to trace what happened to the team next. So here is a little write-up that I found of that Brooklyn Dodgers football team. So alongside the much more popular, of course, Brooklyn Dodgers baseball team, you can see the football team also played at Ebbets Field, the historic ballpark in Brooklyn. And then after that, in 1945, the Dodgers would merge with a team called the Boston Yanks, which then moved back to New York and then became the Bulldogs and then the Yanks again. And then the New York Yanks were sold back to the NFL and were given to an ownership group in Texas to become the Dallas Texans in 1952. But that was short-lived. So 1 year later, that team folded, and then the team was given to the expansion Baltimore Colts, which then, of course, moved to Indianapolis in 1984. So you can trace the Triangles to the Colts. So it's not a connection that the NFL recognizes officially. You can see with all the mergings and foldings, you can kind of see how that might be the case. And then our friend Carl Stork, he remained in the league. He became the NFL's treasurer. He was actually in that role from 1921 all the way to 39, and then he was the league's president from 1939 to 1941. So he was top executive in the league, and then it seemed like that was when they switched from having a league president to the more current commissioner role, and they were looking for someone with a bigger name and a higher profile, and it sort of seemed like he just kind of got pushed out, and it was unfortunate because it seemed like he had really given so many years of his life to the league, and a lot of it in a volunteer capacity, and at least he does have the honor of having been the league's president for at least a couple of years along the way. So as for the field that saw NFL history, so we talked about Triangle Park. In 1941, Deeds and Kettering gave the park to the city of Dayton to ensure its continued recreational use forever as a gathering place. So that's very similar to how National Cash Register would donate lots and lots of parkland, including Hills and Dales and other areas to the city south of town. So this was a similar case just north of downtown. Here's a modern view of that same area. So you can see that baseball diamond later became known as Howell Field, which has its own proud sports history. So that includes when Pete Rose played there frequently in 1960 for a Dayton Amateur League. And then the other element of the old Triangle Park, which does still survive, is one of the locker rooms. So the old locker rooms were still there and were being used for storage many decades after the team folded, and it was moved in 2012 to Carillon Historical Park. So here's a picture I just took of it just a few days ago. So it's right when you first go outside of the main building, you can find it right there, but it's an easy thing to miss. So that is the Triangles locker room. And then you can also, of course, still go back to Triangle Park itself. So it is, used, it has the baseball diamond. It just has a lot of open green space, but it's easy to miss that first, NFL game historic marker. So I'm sure many people probably walk around Triangle Park really having no idea of the history. So where that's circled, that's the little sign that we saw earlier. And then you can see that's the outfield of the baseball diamond. So it's really the same general footprint of where that NFL field would have stood for the historic game. So I mentioned that the league doesn't really recognize the connection between the Triangles and the Colts, but it does honor the history of Dayton and its foundational role in that first game. So in 2019, in advance of the celebration of the league's 100th anniversary, it did recognize Dayton's role and pledged to fund a new artificial turf field at Triangle Park. But as I'm sure many of you are perhaps already aware, concerns were raised over the site and it's passed as a Native American burial ground. So they did a lot of investigations and a survey. And after what they found, they scrapped the plans for the new field. So there was a bit of a delay. That's right when the COVID pandemic hit after that. But the NFL Foundation did still donate $500,000 to build a new turf field. And that was the following year at Kettering Field. And that was finished in June 2020. So here's a picture, and that is the turf field that sits on the site of a former housing complex, which was known as Parkside Homes. And then the final way in which the team has been honored just in the last few years, Alan Farst wrote and directed a documentary film about the team called Triangle Park, and it featured some major NFL names, Chris Collinsworth, Larry Fitzgerald, Kirk Herbstreit, Sean McVay, Troy Aikman, many others are involved to help tell that story of this historic game in Dayton. And I know there were some screenings locally when the film was completed at the Neon Theater and other sites around the area, as well as other cities. But as far as I know, the digital release was postponed, and I think as they were reviewing potential deals, really just to look for long-term stability of the film. I know that's an issue with films and making sure they find the right home. So as far as I know, there isn't a way currently to watch that. I know they did some screenings at the Neon, and I believe there was like a tour around the country just at other like NFL cities that they did for a while. So I'm eager to see that. I know you can see a short trailer that's a couple minutes long on YouTube. So I think that is definitely a cool story. So as I wrap up, I'll just put up afterwards, I'll be here. I do have copies of my book. And then if anyone's interested in following any of my other work on history, I create videos for my YouTube channel. I do articles on my DaytonVistas.com site. And then I'm actually doing a live history and redevelopment talk next Wednesday. So if you're interested in any of that or following along, there is a QR code up there, or you can just search for Dayton Vistas or just go to DaytonVistas.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Yeah.